Hi everyone. I just thought for something different this week, I would do a video recording for the lecture. And there's two reasons for that. One is that I thought that I'd really like to create a bit more opportunity this week in class to actually sit with each group and spend some quality time with each group talking about their group reports, but also thinking about implementation of your projects. And the second reason I thought I would do a recording is because your last assessment requires you to use a community development approach to actually advocate for a particular service or program for the university community. So you're having to use these community development theories and concepts in that last assessment. And because the room that we're in for the lecture doesn't have a recording, I thought it would be nice to actually do this recording so that you'd have something that you could refer back to when it comes time to doing that particular assessment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about in this recording around what is communities. So in order to understand community development, we need to be able to define and have an understanding of what a community is and what it looks like and the characteristics of communities. And then I'll talk a little bit about what community development is. I'll talk about why we do it, what it actually looks like, and also the outcomes of it. And so two of the other concepts that I am going to talk about are social inclusion and social capital. And in fact, I'm going to talk about a couple of forms of capital, not just social capital. So just to position this recording in terms of overall health promotion practice and the range of strategies, this concept of community development sits at this population-based end of the health promotion continuum. So we're talking about community action for social and environmental change. So this is part of that socio-ecological approach to health promotion. At this end of the continuum, we're targeting the determinants of health in the environments in which we live and work. So we're looking at things like risk conditions, and we're also looking at psychosocial and cultural factors as well. So things like, poor social connections, inadequate support networks, as well as looking at those environmental determinants, things like maybe pollution or even poverty. So it's if we think about where community development sits within the other framework that we commonly refer to in the Ottawa Charter, we're talking about that strengthening community action. So health promotion works through concrete and effective community action, and it's about setting priorities, making decisions, planning and implementing strategies with community. We often talk about in community development, we refer to it as being a bottom-up approach. So we work at grassroots level with community. We're not top-down working on community. So I think that's really important. This is a real bottom-up approach. There is an emphasis within this particular action area of the Ottawa Charter on the empowerment of communities. So that's about, the community's level of ownership and control over their endeavours and their destinies, and remembering that the goal of health promotion is to increase people's control. And so community development is a really powerful way of actually building that capacity to deal with a whole range of situations in people's lives. So why do we use community development as approach? Well, one of the reasons is that, humans are inextricably linked to their environments. And so we need to focus on the person and the environment, not just disease or health issues. So think about, social determinants. So we're really looking to address the causes of the cause of health issues. As I said, it's central to our practice in health promotion. And again, we've just seen in that Ottawa Charter, that strengthening community action, that creating supportive environments, those two action areas, or that if we look at that health promotion continuum, the community action for social change on is really fundamental work that we do. And it's recognised, so community development is recognised in some of those key frameworks that we use in health promotion. Since the Ottawa Charter, it's also been recognised in the Jakarta Declaration, the Bangkok Charter, and was originally recognised even in that declaration of Alma-Ata as well. And the other reason why we do community development work in health promotion is that as a profession, we witness firsthand the organic interplay of the individual with the networks, communities, and structures within which they live. So we can bring our knowledge of health promotion, the frameworks that we use, along with that understanding of that interplay to be able to really build capacity of communities and create really, a sense of empowerment within those communities as well. So the core premises of community development are that we know that structures can be oppressive and that they can enhance or prolong disadvantage, and so that their impact needs to be understood and, where possible, challenged. So sometimes institutions, and so when I refer to institutions, I'm talking about those fairly stable social arrangements and practices through which collective actions are taken. So think about things like, the legal system, our education system, healthcare, social services, government, media, and even our criminal justice system. So those are examples of some of those institutions. So those institutions in society are structured in a way that prevents members of a certain group or certain groups from equitable treatment as a whole. And frequently the oppression of any particular member of said group may not always be visible at the level of the individual. And some forms of structural oppression exist as the result of laws or other highly visible public policies. And other forms of structural oppression, such as those that exist due to economic or cultural forms, are sort of more invidious as well. And so even where structural injustice is pervasive or these problems seem insurmountable, change is possible. And we shouldn't underestimate the power of the collective or of the individual. And so community development really draws on the individual and the collective powers to actually bring about changes. Jim Ive, who's a well-recognised author in the space of social work and community development, makes a really important point there, that it's not necessary to engage in the grand gesture or public action in order to change the world, that we can actually bring about changes at small community levels. If we think about these, these forms of oppression, what we also see from this, are stereotypes. So those are the attitudes, beliefs, feelings, and assumptions about certain groups that are widespread and are socially sanctioned. And these we can see, positive stereotypes. So, for example, it might be that people might say that Chinese are really smart, or Africans are good athletes, and there are negatives. So blondes are dumb. Women aren't as smart as men. But all of these have actual negative effects on individuals and social groups. And so these stereotypes support the maintenance of institutionalised oppression by seemingly validating misinformation or beliefs. So to give you an example of these forms of oppression and stereotypes is the gender pay gap. So some people might say, oh, well, this is just a difference in pay that's the result of women's own choices. No discrimination going on here. But while at the individual level it may look that way, we live in a culture where there is still a lot more social stigma against a man who goes on the daddy track compared to a woman who goes on the mummy track. And a lot of husbands in this country will still make it clear to their wives that they wouldn't feel like a real man if their wife kept working while they became the stay-at-home parent. And so the choice, and I'm using inverted commas there, that women make is disproportionately high numbers to be stay-at-home mums isn't often even a real choice at all. So it's a small wonder then that stay-at-home mums are more likely to be depressed than women who work. So there is a real structural oppression against women in this country being maintained by this sexist culture. It's limiting women's ability to generally make their own choices as to how to live their lives, and that limitation is causing an earnings gap. And it takes on average a woman an additional 65 days of work to earn the same as her male counterpart. So while a man is working 365 days, a woman has to work 430 days to earn the equivalent. That's just one example of that oppression and that stereotyping that we see. So how do we define community? Well, there's any number of definitions, and Kenny talks about that, there are a range of meanings behind community. What is community? Many which contain ideological connotations. So it's this ideal of comfort, security, that obscures tensions and conflictive interests. Kenny also goes on to define it as a group of people who share a common identity, such as geographical location, class, ethnic background, or who share a common interest. If you think about, we all belong to different communities. These are sometimes based on places, so where we perhaps live. It might be a sense of shared identity. It might be a shared issue that we identify with. But we all belong to communities, more than one community. We belong to a university community. Our individual classes are a form of community. You might be involved in sport. You might have some hobbies, some recreational activities. You might belong to a church, which is a community. You might live somewhere during university time, so your current sort of place of residence is a community, and perhaps even the hometown where you grew up and perhaps go back to over summer is also a community. You might be a part of an online community, such as an online support group. Maybe you're into online games. That's all part of what would be considered communities. This here just shows you some of those, shared concepts around what is a community. So it can be based on location, geographic area. It might be in terms of ethnicity or our culture, religion, professional. There are professional communities, and those shared issues. So, for example, survivors of child sexual assault are part of a community. It may be an environmental issue that unites a group of people and creates a sense of community. Regardless of this concept, there are certain characteristics that we see in communities. And the first is this human scale. So that is that there's human interactions at a scale that can be controlled and used by individuals. So that's where people know one another or can get to know one another as needed, and where these interactions are also accessible. There's no magic number that can be used to identify the size of a community. It might be 2 people, it might be 2,000 people. But there's no magic number for that. There just needs to be that ability to access and get to know people. The other characteristic that we see is identity and belonging. So that is that people have to identify as being part of that community and have to have a sense of belonging to that community. There are also obligations. So memberships to communities have rights and come with rights and responsibilities. And so there's an expectation that people will contribute to the life of that community by participating actively in some of its activities, and that they will contribute to the maintenance of that community. There's also this concept of what's called Gemeinschaft. And so this is a spontaneously arising organic social relationship that's characterised by strong reciprocal bonds of sentiment and kinship within common tradition. So it's this concept that personal relationships are defined and regulated on the basis of social ideas. And Gemeinschaft is found in small social structures such as the family. If we look back historically, it was in tribes or villages where human relationships are prized, and the welfare of the whole has precedence over the individual. So there's a real feeling of togetherness under this concept of Gemeinschaft. The opposite of Gemeinschaft is Gesellschaft, and that's where relationships are impersonal and indirect, and they're constructed in the interest of efficiency, of economic or political reasons. Okay. The other aspect that we see, or characteristic that we see within communities, is of course culture. And so a community enables the valuing, production and expressing of a local culture, which will have unique characteristics, which encourages diversity amongst communities. So these are just some of the characteristics that we see. Some other characteristics that we see in communities are often highly effective working groups. There's shared responsibility and commitment for the spirit of community. There's consensual decision making. There's a wide range of gifts and talents that are actually celebrated. And there's also this sense of inclusiveness. There's this reflective, contemplative and introspective approach that happens within community, and that they can also facilitate healing as well. This here, I'm not going to read all of these. You can look at these for yourself. The notes for this are up on LMS also, but this just shows, the characteristics of healthy versus unhealthy communities. So if we look at the left-hand side, we can see the characteristics that make up or the characteristics we typically see where we've got healthy communities. So you can see there's things like collaboration, people are focused on the future, they're looking at win-win solutions, there's leadership renewal, people challenge ideas, and of course, that can be a really good thing, but it's about how we challenge those ideas that matters. We've got collaboration, there's a we can do it sort of attitude. On the right-hand side, you'll see those characteristics that we often see in unhealthy communities. So there's this attitude of, oh, nothing works. There's a lack of clarity regarding people's values. They're unable to vision or there's an emphasis on tangibles. There's a few people who seem to do everything. Short-term thinking. People are often attacking each other or their ideas. There's exclusion that happens. They challenge people, not ideas. So it becomes about challenging individuals rather than the actual idea. And they look at win-lose solutions as well. And of course, there's the blockers and the blamers. So these are some of the characteristics that we would typically see in healthy versus unhealthy communities. And the whole idea about community development is that we want to build these particular characteristics, because then we're much more likely to have healthy communities. So how do we define community development? Minkler defines it as the process of working with people as they define their own goals, mobilise resources, develop action plans for addressing problems they have collectively identified. And Kenny talks about it as being a process of working with communities in an environment that advocates full and active participation to help people find plausible solutions to the issues, needs and problems they have identified. So you can see there's a couple of key things that stand out there. One is that it's a process. It's about working with people, working with communities. So that's that real bottom-up approach. We don't work on communities or on people. And the other thing that you'll notice about both of those definitions, that it's about communities being able to identify what the issues are that are important to them, and being involved, which is part of that process of coming up with the solutions and then implementing the strategies to address those issues that they've identified. So community development aims to build viable, sustainable, community-level structures and processes. So it's challenging those forms of oppression. It's challenging the inequities that exist within communities. So as I say, it's a process in health that involves communities identifying their own needs, and some of you will go on and do health promotion program planning and evaluation next year as a subject, where we really take a community development approach in that subject, and you'll actually be going out into communities and doing a needs assessment with a community. It also involves the importance of both the process and the outcome, and so that process of working with people is just as important as the outcome of changing that oppression, changing those structures that are leading to inequities. So that way that we work with people is just as important as what we achieve at the end of it. It's about the empowerment of communities. So because we're drawing on, the local resources, the knowledge, the skills, and mobilising those, we are really creating this sense of empowerment with communities, showing them that they actually do have the skills and the knowledge and the resources. And where they don't have those, we actually work with them to help them to identify where they might actually access those, so helping them to build their own capacity. It's the development of community competence, which links into that idea of capacity building. People are entitled to have control over the issues that affect their lives, and that's because they're involved in the identification of what the needs are. And so, for example, as health professionals, we might see that there's a real issue, in terms of cardiovascular disease, for example, within a community. And we may be, tasked with the idea of reducing rates of cardiovascular disease. However, when we actually start working with community, this may not actually be a priority for that community. They actually might be more worried about the fact that there might be some issues with local traffic, or there might be a problem with a certain bylaw within a community that they would like to have changed. And so as community development workers, we need to be listening and responding to the community in terms of what are the priorities for them. And so the role of the worker is to support communities to develop, and then drawing on principles of equity and social justice. The goals of community development, there are a number of those. So one is around the improvement of quality of life through the resolution of shared problems. And so this might sound far too grand for a small community activity, but it may be as simple as having a local bylaw changed. So, for example, it might be a community that is part on the route between a mine and where the dumping site is. So the bylaw might be actually preventing tip trucks from carrying their uncovered loads through residential areas, for example. So it doesn't have to be massive, grand problem solving here. The other goal is around the reduction in the level of social inequities caused by social determinants of illness, such as poverty. And so actions may entail, if we think about that same example around the transport of mine tailings, might be the provision of transport for local people to attend community health activities in order to make a sustained change for a community provision of access to services that needs to be enshrined in the operational plans of service providers, rather than being ad hoc. So that is having, really good community plans. And that might be something that we help community to articulate. Another goal is around to exercise and enhance democratic principles through people's shared roles in decisions that affect them in their community. So that's around, when maintaining democratic principles, when it's easier and quicker to get on and do it oneself, can be a real challenge for community workers. That we saw in those characteristics of unhealthy communities, that there's a few people who seem to do all of the work, and that's because they have the attitude of, well, it's just easier just to get on and do it. I can just do it myself. And so part of community development and our role as community development workers is to challenge that and to try and advocate and maintain democratic principles where we see, that consensus, coming to consensus about decision making, that we've got more people involved in the process and making the decisions and not leaving it up to just one or two. Another goal is around enabling people to achieve their potential as individuals. And so the involvement in community activity brings its own personal and non-tangible rewards, as well as the development of new knowledge and skills. And at the outset of a program, these gains need to be acknowledged and documented in the objectives of the activity or the project. And then there's also this creation of a sense of community, and a strong, cohesive, successful organisational community will be powerful in creating the sense of belonging and ownership for its members. And it's a means for people to achieve their vision, and we see that in those characteristics of healthy communities. Some of the core principles, social justice, which we've talked about before. So that's redistributing power and resources more equitably and sustainably. And so that social justice is about working for a fairer world. Remember that equity is about fairness. And this includes working for things like social inclusion, collaboration, self-determination, transparency, respect, the sharing of resources, and regard for human rights. It's also one of the other principles is around citizenship and human rights. That's about enabling people to realise and exercise their own human rights. For example, if a community development worker is asked to help a community institute policies and practices counter to human right, for example, maybe the condoning of racism, so our job is to actually, work with people to actually realise and exercise their rights, that actually we don't condone, racism, that is actually a breach of human rights. Empowerment and self-determination. This is through the redistribution of resources that maximises opportunities for people to work together and increases the control over their decision-making, which in turn empowers people. Collective action, so that's action taken by a group of people, not just by an individual. And again, if you think about those characteristics of healthy and unhealthy communities have this collective action approach. And then diversity. So part of community development is around embracing differences, in cultures, in values, in the way in which people prioritise things, how they work, and it's celebrating and embracing those differences in choices and respecting that diversity that exists within communities. One of the things that community development aims to achieve is this notion of capital. There are different forms of capital that are built as a result of community development processes. And one is around economic capital. So I'm talking from a sociological perspective here. This is about the money or wealth that is created through healthy communities. And having this money or this wealth actually gives you access to opportunities, such as education or social networks. There's also human capital. So human capital, is it's about the knowledge or the habits, around and the personal attributes and social attributes, things such as creativity, for example, which are embodied in communities and in the ability to perform labour. And we perform that labour in order to produce economic value. So there's a link there between these forms of capital. One of the things that's not on this slide is also cultural capital. And so cultural capital refers to the education, skills and knowledge which gives us access to economic capital. So again, there's that interrelationship between these forms of capital. And then finally, there's this concept of social capital, which is the processes between people which establish networks, norms, social trust, and facilitates coordination and cooperation of mutual benefit. And there's been a whole lot of work done around social capital, and closely linked. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about that in a bit more detail shortly. Linked to social capital is this notion of social inclusion. And so it's a concept that's promoted within public health literature as a major social determinant of health, the bottom layer of the iceberg. And so social exclusion is the process of being shut out from social, economic, political and cultural systems which contribute to the integration of a person into a community. And what we know is where there are high levels of social exclusion, there are low levels of social capital, and what we see are unhealthy communities. And so social exclusion prevents people from participating in things like education, training, social activities, and from gaining access to services and resources. So one of the things that we're trying to do with community development is to increase people's levels of social inclusion. That's why the process of community development is so important, because it's about creating that sense of social inclusion. So community development involves building social capital, strengthening social interactions within the community, and it's based on trust, mutuality, sharing, and cooperative efforts. Robert Putnam has done some significant research in this space of social capital. And Putnam's study of democratic institutions in Italy in the 90s, the regions most affected in their form of government and more advanced economically were also more civic-minded. So there was higher levels of cooperation, shared responsibility for collective endeavours. There are some risks. So, for example, can have a them and us effect, which can then lead to exclusionary and racist views, such as the neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan as well. Putnam's work in the US back in over a 25-year period, he did over 500,000 detailed interviews with people and communities throughout the United States. And this was published. This book, Bowling Alone, was published in 1995. And what Putnam's work shows is that we're increasingly disconnected from family, friends, neighbours, and our democratic structures. So Putnam's work, as I say, was, he did around 500,000 interviews over 25 years and asked people questions about things like voting frequency, volunteering, church attendance, internet use, drinking in bars, and a whole range of other social interactions. And what Putnam's work shows is that over that 25-year period, people were signing fewer petitions, they belonged to fewer organisations, they know neighbours less, they meet with friends less frequently, and even socialise with families less often. And what he also found was that people were even bowling alone, hence the title of his work. More Americans than ever before were bowling on their own, but were not in leagues, which was typical of how bowling played out throughout the US. Putnam's work shows changes in work, in family structures, in age, suburban life, television, computers, women's roles, and other factors that have helped to contribute to this decline. So his work shows that we've become more alienated from one another, from our political, civic, workplace and religious institutions, and that this disengagement poses a threat to our personal health, our local communities, and even our national well-being. So just some other interesting facts that Putnam's work shows that membership and activity in all sorts of local clubs, civic and religious organisations was falling quite dramatically, that entertaining friends at home has halved. Americans spend about 35% less time visiting with friends than 30 years ago and have dinner together only 2/3 as often as a generation ago. In 2015, Putnam wrote a book called Our Kids, which was a follow-on, and what his work showed, so he looked at American children and social capital, so focusing on children in particular. The work of Our Kids showed that kids are missing so much more than material wealth. They've got fewer mentors, they're half as likely as wealthy kids to trust their neighbours, poorer kids attend schools where fewer sports are offered, they're less likely to participate in after-school activities, their parents have smaller social networks, and their lives reflect the misfortune of the working class adults around them who have lost job prospects and financial stability. More than 60% of children whose mothers never made it past high school will now spend at least some of their life by age 7 in a single-parent household. Back in the 1970s, there was virtually no difference in how much time educated and less educated parents spent on activities like reading to infants and toddlers, which we now know matters tremendously for their brain development. And today, well-off children get 45 minutes more than poor kids every day of what Putnam calls good night moon time. And there's been significant work done by the likes of Professor Pam Snows at the head of the La Trobe Royal Health School around that link between reading language and juvenile delinquency. And so there's correlations there that show that the less children are read to, the less words they have when they enter the education system, and then the more likely they are to disengage in that education system and more likely to then end up in juvenile justice in that system. So Putnam's work shows that we're losing the kind of social capital that helps us to solve big collective problems. So for example, how do we pay for our schools? But as well as that, it's also not helping us to solve the small problems, such as who will look after my child tomorrow. So there's some significant issues around social inclusion and social capital. Think about why you think that might be the case. Some of the reasons that Putnam and others talk about is residential mobility, frequent changes of residence, either in the same city or town or even between cities, states, or other communities. There's suburban sprawl. So we see uncontrolled growth, impacts on people's physical health. People are relying on inactive transport more to access employment, to access leisure. So people exercise less. The sprawl tends to lead to more driving instead of walking, simply because distances to important destinations are greater. There's also the time pressures that increasingly, we're spending longer hours at work. We've got multiple demands competing on our time. There's been changes in family structures. We see more single parent households than previously. And so people are, children in particular, are spending more time commuting. We've seen, increasing pressure on adults to care for older parents because of the pressures on our aged care system, and also because of screen time, things like screen time as well. Have a think about your social interactions and levels of inclusion and what might be some of the things impacting on your ability to be socially inclusive. So just quickly, what does social capital look like? It's about personal relationships, people's networks and social behaviours that support those networks, so spending time or exchanging with others. Social network support, so that is resources, emotional, material, practical, financial, intellectual, or even professional. We want to have an increase of those social support networks. Also has civic engagement, so that is the activities and networks through which people contribute to community. So providing opportunities for things like volunteering, that there's political participation, increasing group membership opportunities, and then increasing that ability for people to actually engage once they are a member of a group. And then trust and cooperative norms. So that's different kinds of trust, norms of reciprocity and non-discrimination as well. This little diagram here just shows the sociology of a community, that it's a combination of this social capital, which is around that trust, opportunities for participation, involvement in clubs and associations. There's a wellness factor to it, so it's about personal safety, social support, social cohesion, housing, access to health services, good standards of living. So some of those basic prerequisites of health are being met. Quality of life, so good state of environment, good economic well-being, again, that community participation, strong community structures, and then the final aspect is around cultural anthropology. So that's that sense of belonging, strong cultural heritage, shared experiences and places. Celebration, community celebration is also really important as well. So community development work actually involves, or what it does is it opens up thinking about how to change these structures, institutions and beliefs. And it can include challenging existing structures, such as campaigning for maybe a change in taxation that favour the wealthy. It might be, for example, resourcing people who are disadvantaged, or establishing choices such as providing, the option for a survivor of family violence to remain in her own home free from violence, or to move into a women's refuge. So actually, giving people, placing the choice in the hands of people. And as I said, community development is both a process and an outcome, and that way in which we work is as important as what we achieve. And sometimes what we achieve may not necessarily be what we have planned for. There can be some unexpected surprises along the way. There is a continuum of health promotion work. At one end of the continuum, we've got this developmental casework. And so this is based on the idea that the role of the community development worker is about changing unequal power and health structures, rather than propping it up with a band-aid approach to victims. There's mutual support. So work at this point is based on the recognition that individuals can develop greater control over their own lives when they are not socially isolated. So it's working to develop mutual support that includes strengthening families, strengthening friendships and neighbourhood networks, linking isolated individuals into existing social groups, or when not possible, looking at ways in which we can develop new social groups as well. As we move into the middle of the continuum, there's issues identification and campaigns. So this point of the continuum is the point that marks that transition from participation for survival to participation to achieve change. And work at this stage must recognise that motivation and identification with the issue must be sufficiently strong for the community to take time away from their lives to actually be involved. As we move further along the continuum, there's participation in and control of services. So this is about encouraging service users, participation, things like consumer reference groups, positions on boards, for example. It's about empowerment, participation, and giving people in communities a voice. And workers, as community development workers, we must deal with the complex issues of when disempowered groups feel able to control services, and that being in control without being ready can be setting people up for failure. And so we need to work out when is the right time, and when have people got the capacity to take that on. And then finally, the other end of the continuum are the social movements. And when people with whom we work become passionately involved with others to change social structures, they begin to believe in having some measure of power over their lives, and they're in control over the things that affect them. So, for example, it might be a climate change group or a multicultural group. The women's movement is a great example of using community development approaches in this social movement end of the continuum. Things like even land care, or even specific health issue groups, so things like cancer support groups, for example. You can read more about this continuum in Talbot and Verinder. Just quickly, a few examples, you're probably sitting there going, well, what does all of that look like? What are some examples of community development work? So there's a couple of that I've picked up on here that you should be familiar with. Things like community gardens are a great example of community development. Things like parkrun, neighbourhood houses, the Star Cinema out at Eaglehawk is a great example of an idea that was generated by the community, and it's still run by the community. It's based on volunteers, so it's a really great example of community development. There is international aid work uses community development approaches, as does natural disaster recovery. You can go and have a look at things like the Make a Change Australia. There's lots of examples there, and also check out the Neighbourhood Houses site as well. That gives you a bit of an overview again about what community development is and how that actually applies to the neighbourhood house movement. One example, I'm not going to go through all of this, that was sort of a statewide approach to community development was the Neighbourhood Renewal Program, which was initiated by the Victorian State Government back in 2001. And the aim of this was to narrow the gap between disadvantaged Victorian communities and the rest of the state. So it was about harnessing the resources and ideas of residents, governments, businesses and community groups to tackle disadvantage in areas with concentrations on public housing. And so it worked with communities and local stakeholders together with the government to prepare an area-based local action plan and oversee its implementation. And you can see on the map here that there are a number of these neighbourhood renewal communities. There's a couple here in Bendigo, Eaglehawk and Long Gully, Maryborough. You can see that there's a number of them. And so each of these local communities had their own local action plan based on the issues that were of importance to these particular communities. There is a video on LMS for this week which actually looks at Heidelberg as an example of neighbourhood renewal. So that goals of neighbourhood renewal, we're looking at things like lifting employment and learning opportunities, enhancing housing and the physical environment, improving personal safety and reducing crime, promoting health and wellbeing. So what are the local health and wellbeing issues? Increasing access to services, increasing people's pride and participation in their communities. So what it was doing was really building that social, economic, human and cultural capital within these communities. The evaluation of neighbourhood renewal saw things like increases in job opportunities, social enterprises were created, reductions in high school absenteeism, there were school regeneration projects that got underway, housing works were completed, community infrastructure started to improve. So things like major IT projects, changes, built infrastructure in parks and gardens, reduction in reported crimes and perceived improvements in government performance. There is a reference there that you can have a look at in terms of the evaluation of this particular community development approach. I have put together some additional references for you. Now, I don't expect you to read or look at all of these. Perhaps pick one or two. My recommendations would be something like IFE and Tesorio. That's a nice little introduction and overview to community development. I also quite like Talbot and Verinder, which I have included on here if you're looking at community development. And just remember that you'll need to come back to this video as you're preparing for that last assessment. And of course, we'll do some work around this in class in the lead up to that assessment as well.